5 armed mercenaries dragged a tortured man through the emergency room doors of Harlow Ridge Medical Center, and not a single doctor moved. They stood frozen, surgeons who had spent years barking orders, residents who thought they owned every room they walked into, and they did nothing. The man on the gurney was barely breathing, his wrists zip-tied, his face beaten beyond recognition. The mercenary leader scanned the room, looked past every physician, every specialist, every person with a medical degree hanging on their wall, and landed on a blonde triage nurse in faded blue scrubs. He laughed. He actually laughed. He had no idea he had just made the last mistake of his career. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because the story you're about to hear is only the beginning. Every week, we bring you stories about the people nobody saw coming, the ones who were counted out, pushed aside, and written off, until the moment everything changed. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The emergency department at Harlow Ridge Medical Center had a reputation in Calverton, New Mexico that nobody on staff liked to talk about out loud. It was the kind of place that chewed through nurses and spit out paperwork. Understaffed, overcrowded, and run by a chief of emergency medicine named Dr. Lawrence Briggs, who believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that the hierarchy of a hospital was a natural law, like gravity. Doctors decided. Nurses executed. And anyone who confused those two roles could expect to hear about it. Sarah Nolan had been hearing about it for 6 years. She worked triage, which meant she was the first person a patient saw when they came through the doors, and frequently the last person anyone on staff paid attention to. She was 37, blonde going slightly dishwater, with a voice that stayed level even when everything around her was collapsing. She had a small scar above her left eyebrow that she'd stopped explaining years ago. Her badge said Nolan, S.A., Triage RN, and most of the attending physicians she worked alongside couldn't have told you her last name if pressed. That Tuesday morning started like most others. She arrived at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her shift, changed into her scrubs in the locker room while the overnight crew debriefed in the hallway outside. She checked the board. 4 patients in rooms, 2 more in the waiting area, 1 in imaging. She pulled the chart on the imaging patient, a 62-year-old man named Gerald Ochoa, who had been sent down for a chest film 40 minutes ago with a notation that read, "Probable costochondritis" in Dr. Briggs's handwriting. Sarah read the vitals the overnight nurse had documented. Then she read them again. She walked to the nursing station and found Marcus Webb, the charge nurse finishing out the night shift, eating a granola bar over a keyboard. "When did Ochoa's pressure drop?" she asked. Marcus looked up. "What?" "His systolic. It was 140 at intake, 112 at 0300, 104 at 05. That's not costochondritis, Marcus." Briggs signed off on the imaging order. "Briggs signed off on it at 11 last night. It's almost 7 now, and nobody's followed up on a patient whose blood pressure has been trending down for 4 hours. Marcus chewed his granola bar. "Sarah, come on. Briggs will be in at 7:30. The man could be dissecting. Or he pulled a muscle helping his grandkid move furniture, which is what he told the overnight doc." She was already moving toward the imaging suite. She found Gerald Ochoa sitting upright on the imaging table, pale and sweating in a way that had nothing to do with the room temperature. He looked at her when she came in like he'd been waiting for someone to notice him for hours, which he had been. "Mr. Ochoa, I'm Sarah. How's your pain right now?" "Different," he said. "It was in my chest before. Now it's more—" He pressed a hand to his upper back. "Here." "Radiating?" "Yeah, started about an hour ago." She checked his pulse manually, rapid, thready. She looked at the imaging tech hovering near the machine. "Has this film been read yet?" "Radiologist is on backlog, probably another hour." "Pull it up." "I'm not supposed to—" "Pull it up." The tech pulled it up. Sarah looked at the mediastinal silhouette on the screen, the subtle widening that Briggs's note from the night before hadn't accounted for, because Briggs had ordered the film based on a presentation that was already 4 hours old. She walked back to the nursing station at a controlled pace that was the closest she allowed herself to running in front of patients. "I need a cardiac surgery consult on Ochoa right now," she told Marcus. "Probable type A aortic dissection. He needs a CT angiogram, and I need someone on the phone with cardiothoracic in the next 3 minutes." Marcus stared at her. Sarah, Briggs is going to... I know what Briggs is going to do. Call it anyway. You're a triage nurse. The way he said it wasn't cruel. That was almost worse. It was just the automatic response. The reflex that had calcified in this department over years of the same hierarchy running the same loops. You're a triage nurse. As if that sentence explained everything about what she should and shouldn't notice. Make the call, Marcus. She made it herself. The cardiothoracic resident who answered was skeptical until Sarah walked her through the vitals trend and described the film findings in terms that stopped the resident mid-sentence. Ochoa was in the cath lab within 31 minutes. The dissection was confirmed. He was in surgery by 9 a.m. Dr. Lawrence Briggs arrived at 7:34, found out what had happened at 7:40, and came to find Sarah at 7:46. He was not there to thank her. You went over my head on a patient I had already assessed. Sarah was charting at a standing terminal. She didn't stop typing. His pressure was trending down for 4 hours, and his pain had migrated. The presentation changed overnight. You are not a physician, Sarah. No, but I'm the person who caught it. What you did could have caused a panic in that imaging suite, disrupted the morning radiology schedule, and wasted a surgical team's prep time on what very well might have turned out to be nothing. She stopped typing. She turned and looked at him. It didn't turn out to be nothing. That's not the point. Mr. Ochoa is alive. The point? Briggs said, and his voice had gone to the particular register he used when he wanted everyone in a 10-foot radius to understand that the conversation was over, is that nurses in this department do not independently escalate physician-assessed cases without consultation. That is not your role. If you cannot operate within that structure, I will find someone who can. He walked away. Sarah turned back to her terminal. She finished her chart. That was 6 months ago. The thing about Harlow Ridge that outsiders didn't understand was that it wasn't a bad hospital. The facilities were decent. The trauma bay had been renovated 2 years prior with a federal infrastructure grant. The nursing staff, by and large, were competent people who cared about their patients and went home exhausted every night because they cared too much. The problem was structural, the way authority pooled at the top and left the people doing the actual moment-to-moment work of keeping people alive feeling like they were operating with their hands tied. Sarah had learned to work around it. She knew which attendings would actually listen when she flagged something, Dr. Yolanda Marsh in internal medicine, who had the rare quality of genuine intellectual curiosity and didn't seem to find it threatening when a nurse knew something she didn't. She knew which residents were so terrified of missing something that they'd over-order tests, and she knew how to use that constructively. She had mental maps of every supply closet in the department, every shortcut through the back corridor to radiology, every quirk of the ancient patient tracking software that locked up when you tried to enter a second address field. She also knew, in the way you know things you can't prove, that Briggs had been documenting against her since the Ochoa incident. Small things. A note in her file about scope of practice concerns. A mention in a department meeting, casual, just in passing, about the importance of nurses understanding their clinical lane. The phrase again. Always that phrase. Her coworkers noticed. Most of them didn't say anything directly because Briggs controlled scheduling and nobody wanted to find themselves on 7 consecutive overnight shifts. Donna Kirsch, the ER charge nurse on day shifts, had pulled Sarah aside in the break room once and said quietly, without much preamble, "He's building something. Just be careful." "I know," Sarah had said. "You might want to lower your profile for a while." "Someone's going to get hurt if I do." Donna had looked at her for a moment with something complicated in her expression. Not disagreement, exactly. More like recognition and resignation and a kind of exhausted respect. "Yeah," she said. "Probably." The morning the Mercenaries came, Sarah had already been at work for 4 hours. She'd handled a pediatric asthma case, 2 lacerations, a man in his 50s with what turned out to be a panic attack presenting as cardiac, and a 19-year-old who'd broken 2 fingers at a construction site and was more upset about whether he'd be able to work the next day than about the bones themselves. She had eaten half a protein bar at approximately 8:15 and abandoned the other half when the asthma case had spiked. Her feet hurt. Her lower back had been carrying a dull complaint since around the 3rd hour. She was at the triage desk when she heard the main doors. Not the sound of them opening. She heard those all day. It was the sound of multiple sets of footsteps moving in a coordinated pattern, Not the shuffle and stumble of someone being helped in by a family member, not the uneven gait of a person managing their own pain. These were deliberate steps, tactical steps, though most people wouldn't have known to call them that. Sarah looked up. 5 men came through the doors. 4 of them were in civilian clothing, cargo pants, dark jackets, the kind of boots that cost real money and weren't bought at a mall. They moved in a loose perimeter formation around a gurney. They were pushing themselves, which was the wrong way to enter a hospital if your intent was to be treated. You didn't bring your own patient transport unless you controlled where that patient went. The 5th man was in front. He was broad, maybe 6'2", with close-cropped gray hair and the particular stillness of someone who'd been in enough situations that adrenaline no longer read as urgency. He had a handgun holstered visibly at his hip. Not concealed, not accidentally visible, but openly displayed, in the way someone displays something when they want you to know the conversation about whether or not they have it is already over. 2 of the men behind him were similarly armed. Sarah looked at the man on the gurney. He was conscious, barely. Mid-40s, military build, that muscle loss and dehydration and what looked like systematic abuse hadn't entirely erased. His wrists had ligature marks layered over older bruising. There were burn patterns on his left forearm in a configuration she recognized as deliberate, not accidental, not chemical splash. Deliberate. His left eye was swollen nearly shut. He was breathing, but each breath had the shallow, guarded quality of someone with compromised rib integrity. Someone had been hurting this man very carefully for what looked like several days. The lead man stopped at the triage desk. He looked at Sarah. Then he looked past her, at the residents visible through the trauma bay window, at Dr. Briggs, who had just come out of a patient room 20 feet down the hall, at the cluster of nurses near the medication station. Then he looked back at Sarah with an expression that said, "You'll do." "We need a trauma room," he said. Sarah kept her voice at its normal register, calm, informational. "Sir, you need to understand that bringing armed individuals into a hospital is trauma room," he said. "Now, our man is injured and needs immediate attention." "What's his name?" The man's expression didn't flicker. "That's not relevant." "His name is relevant to admitting him for treatment." "John Doe, then." A small, cold smile. "Creative, I know." By this point, Briggs had approached. He had the expression he used when he was about to reassert hierarchy, chest slightly forward, voice prepared to drop to its authoritative register. Sarah watched him clock the weapons and recalculate. "What is—" Briggs started. "Trauma room," the lead man said to Briggs, without turning from Sarah. "The nurse was just about to get us one." Briggs looked at Sarah. In his eyes was something she hadn't seen there before. He was looking at her the way people look at someone when they've run out of ideas and need someone else to have one. Sarah looked at the man on the gurney again. Whatever else was happening, whatever these men wanted, whatever this was, the person on that table needed medical attention, and he needed it now. She could see from 10 feet away that his coloring was deteriorating. The guarded breathing was getting more guarded. She made a decision. "Trauma Bay 2, she said. "Down the hall, left." The lead man moved. His team moved with him. Sarah followed, catching Briggs's arm as she passed him. "Call security," she said under her breath, "and then call police." "Sarah, now Dr. Briggs." She didn't wait to see if he would. In Trauma Bay 2, Sarah pulled on gloves and started her assessment while the mercenaries positioned themselves around the room in a way that left no one near the door. The lead man stood at the foot of the gurney and watched her with the patient, measuring expression of someone who is accustomed to watching people perform under pressure. "What's his primary injury?" Sarah asked, not looking up from her assessment. "Multiple." "I can see that." "What caused the most recent acute injury? Did he lose consciousness at any point?" "Does it matter?" "It matters to whether he has a brain bleed." She pressed carefully along the man's rib cage, and he hissed through his teeth, his hand twitching toward her arm and stopping. "At least 2 ribs on the right side," she said to herself as much as anyone. "Possible pneumothorax. I need a chest film and I need a pulse ox on him." One of the other men shifted. "Nobody leaves this room," the lead man said. "I need—" "What's in this room? That's what you have." Sarah looked at him for the first time since they'd entered the bay. She kept her face neutral, not the careful neutrality of someone suppressing fear, but the actual working neutrality of someone running problem assessments. There's a portable X-ray unit down the hall. I can do his chest film here, but I need to page radiology to operate it. Use the phone in this room. It doesn't reach radiology. A pause. Use the desk phone outside the bay. My associate will accompany you. She nodded. She went to the door, one of the armed men half a step behind her, and picked up the desk phone. She paged radiology. She also, with a motion so practiced it was nearly invisible, pressed the silent alarm button embedded beneath the nursing station counter, a feature installed 3 years ago after a domestic violence incident in the waiting room. She'd tested it twice. She didn't know if it still worked. When she turned around, the man on the gurney had his eyes open and was looking directly at her. She returned to the bay. She adjusted his IV line. He'd had one placed badly, likely not by anyone with medical training. And as she leaned close to his face, checking his pupil response, she heard him. His voice was barely breath. Sarah. He knew her name. Don't let them find the drive. She kept her expression entirely still. Sir, I need you to stay calm. Can you tell me your pain level on a scale of Nolan? The faintest stress on her last name. Listen to me. She straightened and turned to reach for a blood pressure cuff. In the second her back was to the room, she allowed herself 2 heartbeats of something that was not quite surprise and not quite recognition, but lived in the space between them. He knew her name. Not just her name, her last name. Used it the way people use last names when they've encountered them on paperwork, on a briefing document, on a file. The lead man had his eyes on her. He's stabilizing, Sarah said, turning back. For now. But I need imaging, and I need it in the next 10 minutes, or his lung is going to... What do you need in this room? The lead man said. I told you, a portable unit and a radiology tech. Is he going to die in the next hour? Sarah looked at the man on the gurney, at the rise and fall of his chest, at the color of his lips, which were not good, but were not yet the color that meant you'd lost the race. Not in the next hour, she said. Probably. The lead man nodded. Then we have time. For what? He looked at her with an expression that was, she realized, as close to honest as he'd been since they walked in. For him to tell us what we need to know. Sarah set down the blood pressure cuff. She looked at the armed men positioned around the room. She looked at the bay doors, which were closed. She looked at the man on the gurney, who had stopped looking at her and was staring at the ceiling with the focused, internal expression of someone doing something specific with their pain, managing it, not surrendering to it. She thought about 6 years of being told to stay in her lane. She thought about Gerald Ochoa, alive in a cardiac rehab program right now, somewhere in Calverton, because she had not stayed in hers. What's your name? She asked the lead man. He smiled. Does it matter? I'll call you something. Call me Rourke. Rourke. She said it flat, the way you'd read a word off a page. I'm going to keep your patient alive. That's what I do here. But I need to know what I'm treating, and I need to know if there are injuries you haven't shown me. Treat what you can see. That's not nurse. He said the word the same way Briggs said it. That flat taxonomical deployment of a professional title as a sentence ender. Treat what you can see. She turned back to the patient. The man on the gurney had his eyes on her again. And in his eyes, beneath the pain and the controlled damage, was something she hadn't expected to see. Not fear, calculation. He was assessing her the way she'd been assessing the room since the moment the doors opened. Taking inventory, running angles, waiting. She'd seen that look before. Not in a hospital. In a briefing room. Her hands kept working. Blood pressure cuff. Oxygen saturation. She called out numbers to the room in general, maintaining the role, doing what the situation required her to appear to be doing. The nurse, focused on her patient, contained by the men with guns and the closed doors and the weight of whatever operation she'd just been pulled into. But her mind was already somewhere else. She knew where the defibrillator cart was positioned relative to the bay door. She knew that Trauma Bay 2 shared a ventilation chase with the storage corridor that ran along the back of the department. She knew that the portable crash cart had a bottom drawer that the day shift staff routinely left slightly open because the latch had been broken for 3 weeks and nobody had put in a maintenance request. She knew, specifically, what was in the back of the supply closet at the end of that storage corridor, because she was the one who had put it there. Outside, distantly, she heard the wail of a siren beginning. Rourke heard it too. He looked at the door, then at Sarah. That's not your doing, he said. She kept her hands moving. Blood pressure cuff. Oxygen saturation. No, she said. Probably just traffic. The man on the gurney, the man who knew her last name, who was watching the ceiling with a soldier's focused patience, turned his head slightly and looked at her with something that might, in better light, have been the beginning of recognition. Outside, the siren got closer. And then it stopped. And the silence it left behind was the specific, weighted silence of something arriving. Rourke moved to the bay window. He looked out. His expression changed. Not much, but enough. One of his men said something to him in a low voice that Sarah couldn't catch. Rourke turned back to the room. For the first time since he'd walked through the ER doors with his handgun visible and his team in perimeter formation and his cold, flat certainty that this woman in blue scrubs was the least dangerous person in the building. For the first time, something in his face was not entirely certain. "Nobody moves," he said. Sarah looked at her patient. Her patient looked at her. She had a fractured rib to stabilize, a potential pneumothorax to manage, and an unknown number of additional injuries to assess on a man who knew her last name and was running some calculation in his eyes that she didn't have all the variables for yet. She also had approximately 4 minutes before Rourke figured out that the silence outside meant something different than he thought it did. She put her stethoscope to the man's chest and leaned close to listen. And he moved his lips, just barely, in the practiced stillness of someone who'd spent years talking without moving. "Storage corridor," he breathed. "Southeast. They don't know about you." She pulled back, pressed the stethoscope to a different position. "They don't know about you. 6 years of blue scrubs and triage charts and being told to stay in her lane. And this man, this battered, patient, calculating man who was running angles from a hospital gurney, had just said 4 words that reached back through all of it and touched something she had kept very carefully locked away. Rourke was on his radio now, voice low and clipped. Sarah hung her stethoscope around her neck. She looked at the IV line, the oxygen saturation monitor, the closed bay doors, the 4 armed men in the room, and the one who was standing between her and everything that came next. She made a second decision. She moved toward the IV stand, adjusting the drip rate with fingers that didn't shake, and in the same motion turned her body 40 degrees so that the crash cart's open bottom drawer was within reach if she dropped her left hand. Rourke was still on the radio. His back was not entirely to her, but close enough. She didn't take the drawer, not yet. She filed the angle away and straightened and looked at the patient, at the man who knew her name and had just told her they didn't know about her. And she gave him nothing in her expression except the professional attention of a nurse checking her patient's status. But her eyes dropped, briefly, to his right hand where it rested against the gurney rail. His index finger moved once, a small, precise gesture. Not a tremor. A signal. Not yet. She understood. She turned and looked at Rourke's man nearest the door. Early 30s, dark jacket, the particular weight distribution of someone carrying more than one weapon. He was watching her the way people watch someone they've already categorized. The nurse. The manageable variable. His eyes tracked her body language for fear response and found what looked like controlled professional tension, which satisfied him, and he looked away. That was the 3rd time in 20 minutes. Someone in this room had looked at her and seen exactly what she needed them to see. She had spent 6 years practicing that. Rourke finished on the radio. He lowered the device and stood for a moment with his back to the room, and Sarah watched the set of his shoulders shift. Not much, but the way a person's posture changes when they've received information that requires recalculation. When he turned around, his face had resettled into its default flatness, but there was something running underneath it now, a tightening. "We're going to need this room for a while longer," he said. "His oxygen saturation is dropping," Sarah said. "I told you I needed that portable X-ray unit." "Is he critical?" "He's declining. That's not the same as critical until it is, and by then you lose your window." Rourke looked at the patient. Something crossed his face that was not quite concern. Men like Rourke didn't carry concern in a straightforward way, but was adjacent to it, a recognition of asset value. The man on the gurney was worth more to him functional than not. "Tanner," he said to the man nearest the door. Tanner looked up. "Go with her. She gets the imaging unit. Nothing else." Sarah nodded before Tanner could say anything and was already moving toward the door. She needed 30 seconds in that hallway, and she needed Tanner to remain exactly as categorically dismissive of her as he'd been for the past 15 minutes. She pushed through the bay doors with Tanner half a step behind, and the ER hallway opened around her, quieter than it should have been, because the remaining staff had done exactly what people with reasonable self-preservation instincts do when armed men occupy a room. They had pulled back, gathered in clusters, and were watching from a distance that felt safe and was probably not. She spotted Marcus Webb at the nursing station. His face when he saw her come out of the bay had the particular quality of a man who had been hoping she would and had not been certain she could. She walked toward him at a measured pace. Tanner stayed close. "Portable imaging," she said to Marcus. "Bay, 2 patient needs a chest film." Marcus blinked. "Sarah, the police are—" "Imaging unit, Marcus. Now." He caught something in her voice or her face, she wasn't sure which, and turned toward the equipment alcove without asking more. Sarah turned slightly, putting her body between Tanner and the nursing station counter, and reached past Marcus to pull a patient chart from the rack. She didn't look at the chart. She looked at the counter surface, at the small items arranged there in their routine positions. The pen cup, the tape dispenser, the phone console with its row of extension buttons. The silent alarm button was a small gray square recessed into the underside of the counter lip. She'd pressed it 20 minutes ago and didn't know what had happened to that signal. She pressed it again now, with her thumbnail, while appearing to initial the chart she was holding. "The unit's in Bay 4, Marcus said, coming back. Tanner was looking at the cluster of staff at the far end of the hall. Sarah set the chart down and turned toward Bay 4 with Marcus and Tanner both in motion behind her. And as she turned, she passed close to the wall-mounted supply cabinet and without slowing reached in and palmed 3 items that her hands found in the dark by memory. A pressure bandage, a 10-milliliter syringe still in its wrapper, and a strip of 4-inch medical tape folded once. She slid them into her scrub pocket in a motion that took less than 2 seconds and involved no hesitation, because hesitation was how you got noticed. Tanner didn't notice. In Bay 4, she helped Marcus wheel the portable imaging unit out of its dock, and as they navigated it into the hallway, she positioned herself beside Marcus and said, at normal conversational volume with Tanner 4 feet away, "The patient in Bay 2 has probable rib fractures on the right side, possible pneumo. I need you to run the film when we get in there. Standard positioning." "Okay," Marcus said. "And Marcus." She paused, adjusted her grip on the unit's handle. "Tell Dr. Marsh that Ochoa sends his regards." She said it like a throwaway comment, the kind of thing people say in hallways when they're thinking about 3 other things. She saw Marcus process it, hesitate, and then nod once with the careful non-expression of someone who understood they'd just been handed something. Yolanda Marsh was not on shift today. Marcus knew that. Sarah knew that Marcus knew that. Ochoa was a reference point between them, a private notation. It was Sarah's way of saying, "This is like that time, and you know what I did then, and you need to get someone on the phone who can authorize what needs to happen next without going through Briggs." Whether Marcus would actually do it was another question. But she'd planted the seed, and she couldn't do more than that in a hallway with Tanner standing 4 feet away, already looking vaguely impatient. They returned to Bay 2 with the imaging unit. What? The portable film took 4 minutes to run. Sarah positioned the patient with the quiet, specific efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, which she had, and as she angled his torso, she leaned briefly close and said, for his ears only, at the threshold of sound, "Name." His lips barely moved. "Garrett." "What's on the drive, Garrett?" A pause. His breath was shallow and controlled. "Financial routing, accounts, 23 shell companies, and where the money actually goes." "Whose money?" People who would prefer the question never get asked. Sarah straightened. "Keep still for the film." He kept still. She had his vitals charting in her head. Blood pressure edging lower than she wanted, sat at 93%, respiratory rate compensating. The rib injury was real, and the compensation pattern was consistent with a partial pneumothorax that hadn't gone tension yet but could. She needed a chest tube setup accessible, and she needed it without asking Rourke's permission, which meant she needed to get it out of supply without anyone noticing she'd done it. She had a plan for that. It was not a good plan in the sense of being elegant or low risk. It was a good plan in the sense of being executable. Marcus ran the film. Rourke watched from the corner of the room with the disengaged attention of a man who understood the process was necessary and had decided to let it happen. The other three men had shifted their positions while Sarah was out of the room. She clocked this without looking like she was clocking it. Two near the main bay doors, one near the supply cabinet on the left wall. The redistribution suggested someone had given them a positioning instruction while she was in the hallway, which meant Rourke had been on his radio again, which meant external coordination was still ongoing. They weren't planning to leave soon. The film confirmed what she'd suspected: two fractured ribs, right side, and a small but real pneumothorax that was currently compensated and would not remain so indefinitely. She showed it to Rourke because showing it to Rourke served her purpose. "He needs a chest tube," she said. "If that lung collapses the rest of the way, he dies. Not in an hour. He dies in about 20 minutes after it goes. The procedure takes 5 minutes if I have what I need." "What do you need?" She listed it. She made the list precise and clinical, and she included 3 items she didn't actually need, because people comply more readily with a list when they can selectively refuse parts of it. It gives them the feeling of control. Rourke refused 2 items, approved the others, and told Tanner to watch her at the supply cabinet. She got what she needed plus the 3 she hadn't needed plus. In the process of working the supply cabinet with Tanner, standing slightly behind her left shoulder, one item she had very specifically not listed and very much needed: a scalpel. Still in its sterile packaging, she folded it into the pressure bandage she'd pocketed in the hall and moved back to the patient. The chest tube procedure was real, and it was necessary, and she did it correctly. Garrett's vitals responded. His SAT climbed back to 97. His color improved in the incremental, undramatic way that patient improvement actually looks. Not the sudden flush of health that people expect, but a slow, almost grudging return. He was breathing better. That was what mattered. "Good," Rourke said. "He needs fluids, and he needs rest, and you need to tell me what else happened to him that I haven't seen yet," Sarah said. She was discarding her gloves. Her voice was even. "There are injuries on his arms that weren't accidental. If there's internal damage from those, I need to know." "He's fine." "You're not a medical professional." "No," Rourke said. "I'm not." She looked at him. "Then don't tell me he's fine." A beat. Rourke's expression didn't change, but his pause had a quality to it. Not respect exactly, but a recategorization. Like he was running her through a revised assessment, and the output was slightly different from before. "He took a hit to the abdomen 2 days ago. We've been monitoring. Any guarding, rigidity?" "Some." "I need to palpate his abdomen. Do it." She did. Garrett tolerated it with his jaw tight and his eyes on the ceiling. The guarding was real. Right upper quadrant, which could be liver, could be kidney, could be a dozen things she couldn't rule out without imaging she didn't have in this room. She ran through her mental triage. Priority 1 was the airway and breathing, which were now managed. Priority 2 was circulation, which was marginal but holding. Priority 3 was everything else. "I can keep him stable," she told Rourke, "but stable doesn't mean improving. He needs a CT, and he needs a surgeon's assessment of that abdominal injury, and neither of those things can happen in this bay." "Then keep him stable." "For how long?" "Until we're done here." She turned back to her patient. 2 hours passed. Not evenly. Not in the way time passes during a quiet shift. It passed in the contracted, hyper-specific way that time passes when you are doing multiple things simultaneously and tracking more variables than you can consciously name. Sarah had been in situations before where the texture of time changed like this, where every minute felt like it had additional weight, where her peripheral awareness expanded and sharpened and noticed things at the edge of vision that she normally would have processed and discarded. She hadn't been in one since she'd left. She managed Garrett's vitals. She watched Rourke's men. She counted their weapon checks, how often each man touched his holster or jacket, which was different from person to person, and told you things about their comfort level and their experience. Tanner checked frequently, which meant anxiety. The man by the left wall almost never, which meant either extreme confidence or detachment. Rourke himself moved his right hand near his holster exactly twice in 2 hours, and both times it was in response to sounds from outside the bay. Once a cart in the hallway, once what might have been a raised voice somewhere in the department. The raised voice was the more interesting one. She thought she recognized it, but she wasn't certain. At the 2-hour mark, Rourke's radio produced a burst of static, and a voice said something that made him cross the room in 3 steps to confer with Tanner in a voice too low for Sarah to catch. She was at the patient's bedside, rechecking his IV line, and she used the fact of their turned backs to lean close to Garrett. "What's outside?" she said, barely breath. "Don't know," he murmured. "But someone called it in. The drive's secured. They can take this room apart. They won't find it." "Where is it?" A fractional pause. "Somewhere they already searched." Sarah straightened. The IV line was fine. She turned back to the monitoring equipment and adjusted a setting that didn't need adjusting, giving herself a reason to face the display screen and therefore have her back to the room, which gave her 3 seconds to think without her face being observable. The drive was already in this hospital. Not on Garrett, somewhere in the hospital. Somewhere Rourke's team had already looked and not found it, which meant either they'd missed it, or it had been moved, or it had been placed somewhere after they arrived. She thought about the timing. Garrett had come through those doors barely conscious. He hadn't been walking, hadn't been touching surfaces. He hadn't placed anything anywhere. But someone else had. The raised voice she'd maybe recognized. She turned around. "I need to check on the other patients in this department," she said to Rourke. He looked at her. "I am responsible for triage on the entire floor," she said. "If someone comes in critical while I'm in here and they don't get assessed, there are other nurses. I'm the charge triage. If something goes wrong with a patient I didn't see, that's on my license." It was partially true, and she knew he couldn't verify which parts. More importantly, she knew that the framing, her license, her professional accountability, was the kind of tangible bureaucratic concern that landed differently than a more emotional appeal. Rourke was a man who understood accountability structures. He looked at Tanner. 2 minutes, he said. Tanner goes with her. She talks to no one outside the department. "I need to speak with the triage desk to check the board." Tanner stays close. "Fine." She went out into the hallway again with Tanner behind her, and this time the hallway was different. The staff clusters she'd seen before had shifted. The far end of the hall was quieter in a way that felt deliberate rather than evacuated. The specific quiet of people who've been told to be quiet, rather than people who've dispersed. 2 nurses she didn't recognize were near the elevator bank, and one of them made brief eye contact with her and then looked away, which was one contact too many for a random glance. She checked the triage board at the desk. Nothing critical pending, which was either luck or someone had made sure of it. She looked at the board with full attention for the 4 seconds it required, and then looked past it, at the corridor that led to the back of the department, the one that ran alongside the storage rooms and eventually connected to the maintenance access stairs. The supply closet at the end of that corridor. She'd put things in that closet on her first week at Harlow Ridge, which had struck her colleagues as excessive, and had struck Donna Kirsch as quietly notable, and which Sarah had told herself was simple professional preparedness, and had never examined beyond that because examining it would have required admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. She was ready now. "I need to check our supply levels," she said to Tanner. "We may have depleted chest tube supplies treating your patient." 30 seconds, Tanner said. "It takes 30 seconds to read a shelf." She walked toward the back corridor. Tanner followed. The hallway narrowed, a familiar narrowing, the slight shabbiness of the rear corridor that the renovation hadn't reached, the flickering fluorescent second from the end that the maintenance request for had been open for 14 months. She knew this corridor the way you know a space you've walked in the dark. She knew the exact distance from the elevator bank to the storage room door. She knew the sound the door latch made when it was fully engaged versus when it had been left slightly off, a difference of maybe 2 millimeters that produced a completely different acoustic signature. The door latch sounded off when she reached it. Someone had been in this closet recently. She opened the door and went in. Tanner stood in the doorway. The closet was a long, narrow room, shelving on both sides, a pull chain light overhead that she didn't reach for because the hallway fluorescent was sufficient to see by. She moved to the right side shelving and began scanning the chest tube supplies with the practiced efficiency of someone actually checking inventory. In the back left corner of the closet, at floor level, behind a box of sterile irrigation fluid that had been sitting in the same position for 8 months, because nobody had ordered that particular irrigation format in almost a year, was a very small rectangular device in a waterproof case approximately the size of a USB drive. She didn't reach for it. She didn't look at it. She counted the chest tube units on the right shelf. They had 4 remaining, which was adequate, and turned back toward the door and said to Tanner, "We're fine on supplies," and walked out. What she had seen could not be unseen. What she now understood could not be unknown. The drive was in the supply closet, which meant someone on her staff, or someone accessing this corridor, had placed it there after Rourke's team arrived, had placed it somewhere they'd already searched, exactly as Garrett had said, which meant someone outside that trauma bay had been communicating with Garrett, or with someone connected to Garrett, after the mercenaries arrived. She walked back toward the bay with Tanner at her shoulder and her mind running very fast through a sequence of implications. The raised voice she thought she'd recognized. The nurses by the elevator who'd made one contact too many. The 2-minute window Rourke had granted her on the basis of an argument about her license. Someone was running a parallel operation in this hospital, and they had used the 2 minutes she'd negotiated to make sure she'd see exactly what she needed to see. She stopped outside Bay 2's doors. Tanner reached past her and pushed them open. Inside, the scene had changed. Rourke was standing at the head of Garrett's gurney, and Garrett was more alert than he'd been. The vitals had improved, which Sarah had expected, and the conversation that had clearly been happening when they entered resumed around Sarah's arrival because Rourke hadn't paused it. "Last time," Rourke said to Garrett, "the account routing codes. All of them." Garrett looked at the ceiling. "I can make this a very long night," Rourke said. He said it without inflection, which made it worse. Garrett said nothing. Rourke looked at Sarah. His look was assessing, and something in it had shifted again, but the same recategorization she'd seen before, but further along now, like he'd been adding data points since she walked in. "You and he have a connection," Rourke said. It wasn't a question. "I'm his nurse." Before that, Sarah kept her face level. "I don't know him. He said your name when he came in. Patients often know staff names. We're introduced at intake. He was unconscious at intake. He was semi-conscious. It's common for patients to retain more than—" "Stop." Rourke's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'm not asking you to explain. I'm asking you to confirm." Sarah looked at him across the gurney. What was in her chest right now was not fear. Fear was something she'd trained with, worked alongside, learned to use as information. What was in her chest was something older and more specific. The feeling of a perimeter closing. The feeling of available space compressing around a situation until the number of options reduced to one. She'd felt it before. She'd felt it in places that didn't look anything like a hospital trauma bay in Calverton, New Mexico. "I don't know him," she said. Rourke held her eyes for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Tanner. "Take her to the storage room." And Tanner's hand closed around her arm, and Sarah did not pull away, because pulling away now would cost her something she wasn't prepared to spend yet, and because the storage room was exactly where she needed to go. Tanner's grip on her arm was firm but not brutal. The grip of someone who'd been trained to restrain rather than injure, which told her something about his background and also about Rourke's operational standards. He steered her out of the bay and into the hallway, and she let him, because fighting in the hallway was a worse option than cooperating until she had better ground. The back corridor was emptier than it had been 20 minutes ago. That was interesting. Tanner moved her toward the storage room at a pace that was not quite a march, but close to it, and Sarah walked with him without resistance and used the walk to inventory what she had. The scalpel in the pressure bandage in her left scrub pocket, the syringe still in its wrapper in the same pocket, the strip of medical tape. The items she'd accumulated over the past 2 hours the way water accumulates in a low place. Not dramatically, just inevitably, because that was the direction everything was tilted. The storage room door. The same one she'd been in 11 minutes ago with Tanner in the doorway. He pushed it open and put her through it and followed her in and let the door swing partially closed behind him. Not fully latched, she heard the difference, and turned on the overhead pull chain light. "Rourke wants to know what you know," Tanner said. "Simple conversation." Sarah looked at the shelving, at the box of sterile irrigation fluid in the back left corner. "I'm a triage nurse," she said. "Right." He said it with the particular flatness of someone who'd stopped believing the sentence the 3rd time he'd heard it. "So you won't mind telling me how you knew to check the patient's pressure trend when the admitting physician had already assessed and cleared him?" She looked at him. "That was 6 months ago. You've been watching me for 6 months. He didn't answer, which was an answer. She turned slightly, putting the left side of her body toward the shelving, and reached up to the second shelf as though steadying herself. Her left hand was at pocket level. "What does Rourke actually want?" "The drive." I don't know where the drive is. You were in this room 11 minutes ago, checking inventory. With my eyes on you the whole time. Then you know I didn't touch anything. Tanner moved a step closer. Not threatening yet, measuring. Here's what I know. Garrett said your name. You've been running this floor like you're managing a tactical situation, not a medical one. And you went straight for this room the second Rourke gave you an opening. He paused. So, who are you? Sarah looked at him. The pull chain light overhead was 40 watts at most, and it gave the room the flat, depthless illumination of a place designed for storage rather than occupancy. In that light, Tanner's face had the slightly unreal quality of someone who'd been awake too long, the eyes doing more work than usual to compensate for a body running on reserve. She made a decision, and then she made a different decision, and then she made the first one again, all in approximately 1.5 seconds. I'm nobody, she said. He reached for her arm again. She let him get 3/4 of the way there. The syringe cap came off in her pocket. She'd been working it loose for the past 30 seconds with her thumbnail while they talked. And when his hand closed on her left arm, she drove the needle into the lateral side of his neck at the junction of the sternocleidomastoid. Not deep, not a vascular injection, just subcutaneous delivery of the 10 milliliters of saline she'd loaded in the hall. It wouldn't hurt him. It would shock him. A needle in the neck produces an involuntary flinch response in virtually every person who is not specifically trained against it, and Tanner had not specifically trained against it, and his hand released her arm. She stepped back. He put his hand to his neck. His eyes had gone wide and then immediately narrowed, running the assessment. What just happened? What was in the syringe? What is this doing to my body right now? And in the 3 seconds that process took, Sarah was at the back left corner of the room. She had the drive in her hand. Celine, she said, you're fine. Nothing's happening to your body except adrenaline. Tanner stared at her. His hand was still at his neck. His other hand was moving toward his holster. If you pull that weapon in this room, Sarah said, the sound goes through those walls to the hallway, and whatever is happening outside this door right now gets complicated for Rourke very fast. I don't think he wants complicated. A beat. Tanner's hand stopped. Who are you? He said again, and this time it was different. The flatness was gone. In its place was something raw, not fear, but the specific unease of a person who has been operating on a set of assumptions and has just watched one of them fail. Sarah looked at the drive in her hand. Small, waterproof case, matte black, about the weight of a car key. She closed her fingers around it. I told you, she said, I'm nobody. She had approximately 4 minutes before Tanner made a decision about what to do next. He was not a stupid man. She'd established that over the past 2 hours, which meant he wasn't going to stand in the storage room indefinitely. He would either come after her, call Rourke, or both, and those weren't mutually exclusive outcomes. What he would not do, she calculated, was fire a weapon in this corridor, because Rourke's operation had already been compromised by noise and attention and the siren that had arrived and gone quiet outside. And another loud event was the last thing any of them wanted. She went out the storage room door into the back corridor. She went left instead of right, away from the main ER floor, toward the maintenance access stairs at the end of the building. She moved at a pace that was fast without being a run, because running in a hospital produced a different category of attention than walking quickly. And the 2 people she passed in the next 30 seconds, a radiology tech she didn't know by name, and a woman in a visitor's lanyard who looked lost, registered her as a nurse moving with purpose rather than a person fleeing, which was the correct impression to produce. The maintenance stairs were behind a door marked Staff Only, authorized access that was never actually locked because the electronic lock had failed 8 months ago and the replacement parts were on back order. She went through it and up one flight and emerged onto the second-floor maintenance landing, which connected via a graded walkway to the building's mechanical room and from there to the roof access hatch. She had been up here once. On her first week at Harlow Ridge, she'd told Donna Kirsch she was doing a personal evacuation route survey for emergency preparedness, which was a true statement that also happened to be the least important reason she was doing it. Donna had given her the access codes because Donna was the kind of charge nurse who believed in knowing every exit and every entry point and trusted people who demonstrated the same instinct, and the codes hadn't changed in the intervening 6 years. The mechanical room smelled of dust and old rubber and the particular metallic warmth of HVAC equipment that runs 24 hours a day. She crossed it in the dark by memory. The layout was simple: 2 rows of equipment with a walkway between, a cable conduit along the left wall, and found the roof hatch in 40 seconds. The hatch opened on a tar and gravel roof in afternoon light that felt, after 6 hours indoors under fluorescence, almost physically forceful. The sun was at about 40 degrees, Calverton's high desert air dry and cool at elevation, the sky the kind of hard, clear blue that existed only at altitude. She stood for a moment and let her eyes adjust. The roof of Harlow Ridge was not large: 4 mechanical housings, 2 HVAC units, a comms array, the elevator shaft housing on the north end. Low parapet wall around the perimeter, maybe 3 feet, concrete cap on top. She moved to the south parapet and looked down at the hospital's access road and parking structure. She counted vehicles. 3 she didn't recognize in the fire lane: 2 dark SUVs and a panel van, backed in, which was how you positioned vehicles when you expected to move fast. A 4th SUV was parked nose in at the end of the structure, engine likely running because she could see the faint exhaust shimmer in the air above its tailpipe. Rourke had more people outside. She'd expected that. She'd started expecting it when the siren came and went without producing anyone coming through the bay doors. She crouched at the parapet and looked at the panel van. The rear doors were closed. 1 man visible near the van's passenger side, another at the near end of the parking structure, both positioned for observation coverage. She tracked their sight lines. They were watching the hospital's main entrance, the emergency entrance, and the ambulance bay. The rooftop was not in their rotation. She looked at the drive in her hand. She needed to get it off this roof and out of the building and into the hands of whoever Garrett was connected to. And she needed to do that without crossing any of the ground-level observation points. And she needed to do it in a way that didn't require her to be on this roof when Tanner told Rourke where she'd gone. She had been a long-range reconnaissance asset for 4 years before she'd gone to the medical track. What that meant, in practice, was that she had spent a significant portion of her adult life solving exactly this category of problem: how to move something valuable from a position under observation to a position of safety, and that the skills involved in solving it were not the kind that went away if you ignored them long enough. They went dormant. They waited. She looked at the comms array on the north end of the roof. Then she looked at the panel van. Then she looked at the parking structure's second level, which was partially visible from here, the top deck, open air, with a sight line to the hospital's north face that the ground-level observers didn't have covered. There was a vehicle on the top deck of the parking structure that hadn't been there when she'd arrived this morning. She was certain of this because she parked on the second level, and she'd noticed the top deck was empty when she'd walked in, the way you notice open space at elevation without consciously deciding to. The vehicle was a gray pickup, backed into the north corner of the top deck. It had been there at some point in the past 6 hours. She watched it for 90 seconds. No movement. No visible occupant. She watched the 2 outside observers instead. Their rotation. Their intervals. The pattern in how they moved. Not a fixed schedule, which meant they'd been trained not to be predictable, but patterns existed anyway because human beings produce them without meaning to. She had a window of approximately 40 seconds in which neither observer would be looking at the hospital's north face above ground level. The window repeated on an interval she estimated at 6 to 8 minutes. She went back through the hatch. She came down through the maintenance stairs to the second floor and went through the door into the hospital's upper corridor, which connected the medical surgical ward to the administrative offices to the covered walkway that bridged to the parking structure. The walkway was glassed in on both sides, visible from the outside, and she moved through it with her head slightly angled, not ducked, not hurried, because ducking and hurrying were visible behaviors, and visible behaviors were the problem. She was across the walkway and in the parking structure stairwell and up 2 flights before she allowed her pace to increase. Top deck. The gray pickup was backed into the north corner exactly where she'd seen it from the roof. She approached it at an angle from the passenger side, and before she was within 20 feet, the driver's window came down. The man behind the wheel was maybe 45, brown hair going gray at the temples, wearing a jacket that was 1 weight class too heavy for the current temperature. His eyes found her immediately with the directional certainty of someone who'd been watching the stairwell door. "Nolan," he said. It wasn't a question. "Who are you?" she said. "Someone who's been waiting for you to come out of that building for 4 hours. He nodded toward her closed hand. "Is that it?" She looked at him, at the jacket, at the way he was sitting, weight slightly forward, hands visible on the steering wheel in the deliberate positioning of someone who understood that visible hands communicated specific things to specific people. "Show me something," she said. He reached slowly into his jacket and produced a credential wallet. Federal. She didn't recognize the specific sub-agency. It was a three-letter designation she'd seen referenced, but never directly. But the credential format was real, and the photo matched, and the holographic elements were correct to her knowledge. "Where's the team?" she said, building perimeter. "We've been holding position. Rourke has a two-person fire support element on the north access road, and we needed to isolate them before we moved." He looked at her hand again. "Does Garrett know you have it?" "He knew where it was. He pointed me toward it." "He knew where it was. He pointed me toward it." "Did he give you anything else?" "Verbal?" 23 shell companies, account routing codes. The man nodded. "Okay." He picked up a radio from the center console. "I need 60 seconds from you. Can you go back into that building?" Sarah looked at him. "Not the way you came out," he said. "Ambulance bay, north side. There's a secondary entrance past the equipment dock that doesn't have Rourke's people on it. We need you back in that bay with Garrett. We're pulling everyone out, but we can't do it without someone in that room who can move him. He has a chest tube, recent placement. He can't be moved without... We have a medic on the team. Your medic hasn't seen his vitals for the past 4 hours. I have." She held his eyes. "I go in, I manage the extraction. Your team provides the exterior. That's the arrangement." A pause. He looked at her with the assessing expression she'd been receiving from men all day. But this one was different in quality from Rourke's assessment, from Tanner's. This one was not looking for weakness or leverage. It was looking for competence in finding it. "Agreed," he said. She handed him the drive. He took it and had it in a secure pouch inside his jacket in 4 seconds. 60 seconds, he said. "Ambulance bay north entrance. When you hear 3 knocks on the bay door, not the main doors, the equipment bay door on the west wall. That's us." She was already moving. The ambulance bay north entrance was a service door with a keypad lock that ran on a separate circuit from the main ER access system, and Sarah knew the code because she was the triage nurse who coordinated ambulance intake, and the code was her code. She went in and was back in the hospital in under 90 seconds from leaving the pickup. The ambulance bay was clear. She moved through it to the interior corridor and back toward the ER, and the difference between this corridor and the one she'd left through the storage room was immediately apparent. 2 of Rourke's men were now in the hallway, not inside Bay 2. They'd spread out, which meant Rourke knew she was loose in the building. She walked directly at them. Not a run, not a hesitation. A direct, purposeful walk in the direction of the nursing station. Scrubs, stethoscope around her neck. The uniform of someone who belonged here, which she did, which was a fact that Rourke's operation did not change. The nearer man moved to intercept her. "Rourke wants you." "I was getting supplies," she said. "Your patient's saturation is dropping again. If you want to explain to Rourke why he died while you were standing in a hallway." She kept walking. He fell in beside her rather than in front of her, which meant she was still setting the pace, which was what she needed. She pushed through the bay doors with him half a step behind her and was back in Trauma Bay 2, and the scene she walked into was different from the one she'd left. Rourke was at Garrett's bedside, and Garrett's face was pale in a way that read as more than pain. The monitor behind him showed a saturation of 89. His respiratory rate had climbed. The chest tube, she assessed in the first 2 seconds, might have shifted. That happened. It wasn't a failure of placement. It was a reality of tube management in a patient who'd been moved and repositioned over several hours. "He went down 5 minutes ago," Rourke said. There was an edge in his voice that hadn't been there before. Not panic. Men like Rourke didn't panic, but proximity to it. "I need everyone back from the gurney," Sarah said. "What happened to... back from the gurney?" She moved to Garrett's right side and put her stethoscope to his chest. Decreased breath sounds on the right. The tube had migrated. Not critical yet, but the trajectory was clear, and the trajectory was what killed people, not the current number. "I'm going to readjust the tube," she said, to Garrett as much as to the room. "You're going to feel pressure. It'll be brief." Garrett looked at her. His color was bad and his eyes were slightly glassy, but there was still the same specific quality of attention in them, the awareness, the calculation. And when she leaned over him to access the tube site, he said, too low for Rourke to catch from where he was standing. "How long?" "Minutes," she said. "Stay with me." She readjusted the tube with the particular combination of delicacy and decisiveness that the procedure required, and it was not clean, and it was not elegant, and Garrett made a sound that he immediately controlled, jaw tight, because he was that kind of person. The monitor climbed, 89 to 91 to 94 over the following 90 seconds. "Better," she said. Rourke had been watching her. She could feel it without looking. "You left this room," he said. "I got supplies." Tanner said, "Tanner was in my supply closet when I needed to do my job." She pulled off one glove and then the other. "Your patient is stable again. You're welcome." The silence in the room had a different texture now. Rourke was looking at her with the expression that had been evolving all afternoon, the one that started as dismissal and had been revising itself incrementally through calculation and was now somewhere else entirely, somewhere she didn't have a clean word for. "Where's Tanner?" he said, to no one in particular. One of the other men said, "Radio silence." Rourke's jaw moved. "Sarah." He said her name for the first time. Just her first name, the way you say the name of someone you've decided to speak to directly. "I want you to understand something." "I'm listening." "Whatever you've done in the past hour, I don't know what it is yet, but I will know. And when I know, the options available to everyone in this room are going to narrow significantly." He paused. "So if there's something you want to tell me before that happens, now is the time." Sarah looked at him across Garrett's body. She thought about 6 years of being told to stay in her lane. She thought about Gerald Ochoa in cardiac rehab. She thought about Donna Kirsch's face in the break room. Be careful. And about the morning she'd driven to Calverton from a place that no longer existed in her life, carrying a duffel bag and a set of skills she'd been trying to retire, and a name that nobody at Harlow Ridge Medical Center knew anything about. She thought about the 3 knocks that were coming on the equipment bay door on the west wall. "I understand your concern," she said, "but right now your patient needs monitoring, and I need to stay focused on that." Rourke studied her. Outside, somewhere in the structure of the building, she heard something that might have been movement, and might have been the normal percussion of a hospital in operation. She'd been listening to the ambient sound of this building for 6 years, and she knew the difference. That particular sound, contained, purposeful, positioned, was not HVAC. Rourke heard it too. She saw his eyes shift. 3 knocks on the equipment bay door, on the west wall, not loud, not urgent. 3 clean, measured knocks, the exact interval she'd been told. Every person in the room heard them. Rourke's hand went to his radio. Sarah's hand went to Garrett's gurney rail. She looked at Garrett. He was looking at the door. And then the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a partial failure, full darkness, the complete and instantaneous absence of illumination that meant someone had cut the main circuit, not tripped a breaker, because a breaker failure flickered first and this had not flickered. Whoever was outside this building had killed the power to the section, which meant they'd had access to the electrical routing, which meant this had been planned for longer and in more detail than Rourke knew. In the darkness, Sarah's hand found Garrett's wrist. She felt his pulse. She heard Rourke move. She heard the rack of a weapon being prepared. And she heard, from somewhere on the other side of the equipment bay door on the west wall, a sound that was not a knock and was not a voice, but was the specific sound of a latch being released from outside by someone who had the code to release it. The latch released with a sound like a held breath finally let go. The equipment bay door opened inward, and the darkness in the room was not uniform anymore. There was the pale rectangle of a corridor emergency light behind whoever came through, enough to produce silhouettes, but not faces. Sarah counted 3 figures in the first 2 seconds. Tactical entry pattern, low and offset, the kind of movement that came from practice so repeated it had stopped being conscious. She had already dropped below the gurney rail, pulling Garrett's IV line long to give him slack, her hand on his arm telling him without words to stay flat and stay still. He did. The calculation in him hadn't gone anywhere. Rourke's voice came from somewhere to her left, at about 2 o'clock relative to the gurney. Down, weapons down. He was not talking to her. The response from the door was not words. It was a directed flashlight beam that found Rourke's man near the supply cabinet first, then swept to the second man at the bay doors. And in the beam, Sarah could see the red targeting dots that arrived just ahead of each sweep, like punctuation. The men with the dots on them went very still in the particular way that people go still when they understand that stillness is the only option still available. Rourke. The voice from the door was the man from the pickup on the roof deck. Hands where we can see them. Do it now. A pause. A long one. Sarah had her hand on Garrett's arm, and she could feel his pulse, fast but steady. The pulse of someone whose body was under stress but whose mind was doing something specific and controlled with that stress. And she waited through the pause the way she'd learned to wait, which was without interpreting it as positive or negative until it resolved. Rourke said, "This isn't over." "Put your hands up," the voice said. "We'll discuss what it is." Two more flashlight beams entered the room from different angles, the main bay doors now, which meant the team had split entry points, which meant they'd had the bay mapped before the lights went down. Someone had given them a layout. Sarah thought about Marcus Webb at the nursing station and the way he'd nodded when she mentioned Ochoa. The overhead emergency lighting came on, not the full fluorescence, but the battery backup system, the amber-toned strip lights at floor level that gave the room a strange underlift quality. Enough to see faces. Rourke had his hands up. His expression was the expression of a man doing a specific kind of math. Not defeat, not panic, but the cold, rapid accounting of someone calculating which losses were recoverable. Both of his remaining men in the room had been put against the wall by two members of the entry team, secured with a speed and confidence that suggested they'd done exactly this many times before. Tanner was not in the room. Sarah filed that. She stood up from beside the gurney, and the entry team lead, the man from the pickup, looked at her across the bay with an expression that was not quite relief and not quite respect, but lived adjacent to both. "Patient status," he said. "Stable. Chest tube is in. SAT was 94 last I checked." She was already reaching for the monitoring leads to verify. "He needs transport to a facility with surgical capability. The abdominal injury hasn't been imaged. Transport is 10 minutes out." Garrett's voice came from the gurney, rough and low. "Voss." The entry team lead, but Voss, apparently, looked at Garrett. Something passed between them that Sarah didn't have the context to read fully, but read as a long professional history compressed into a single look. "You look terrible," Voss said. 4 days, Garrett said. "Cut me some slack." "When you're ambulatory," Voss turned back to Sarah. "We need the room cleared. Rourke's exterior element is being handled, but we've got a missing man, the one you encountered in the storage room." "Tanner." "He went off radio. If he's still in the building, he knows the building's compromised," Sarah said. "He'll be moving toward an exit that doesn't have your people on it." She thought about the layout, the routes she knew. "Service elevator to the basement. There's a loading dock on the east side that your perimeter won't cover from the parking structure." Voss looked at her for 1 second, then into his radio. "East loading dock, basement level. Possible fugitive, male, dark jacket, armed, intercept and hold." Static, then an acknowledgement. Rourke had been watching this exchange. When Sarah looked at him, his expression had shifted again. That same incremental revision, but this time it had passed through the phases she'd observed across the afternoon and arrived somewhere new. Not recalculation. Something that was, if she read it correctly, the specific look of a man understanding he has been outmaneuvered not by a superior force, but by a variable he fundamentally misread. "Who are you?" he said. To Sarah. The same question Tanner had asked in the storage room, but from Rourke, it was weighted differently. Not a challenge, not suspicion, but something almost genuine. Sarah checked Garrett's saturation. 95. She adjusted the oxygen flow. "I told you," she said without looking up. "I'm a triage nurse." The next 40 minutes were not clean. Nothing about the logistics of removing an armed mercenary operation from a functioning hospital emergency department was clean, and Sarah had known that since the moment she first looked at the situation's terrain and understood that the resolution, when it came, would involve a number of moving parts that couldn't all be controlled simultaneously. The power came back on in sections. The surgical wing first, then the administrative floors, then finally the ER. And in the restored light, the damage to the department's normal operation was visible in all its mundane reality. Carts displaced. Patients who'd been in curtained bays relocated to the corridor for safety and not yet moved back. One resident, a second-year named Pollard, who'd been in the department when the mercenaries arrived, sitting against the wall outside Bay 1 with the particular stillness of someone whose body had been running on adrenaline for hours and had just been told it didn't have to anymore. Sarah assessed Pollard as she passed him. No physical injury, shock response, mild. She got him water and told him to stay seated and that someone would check on him shortly, and he looked up at her with eyes that were slightly too wide and said, "Is it over?" And she said, "The dangerous part," and kept moving because the dangerous part being over didn't mean her job was. The federal transport team arrived at 9 minutes rather than 10, which was the kind of minor deviation that mattered less than it would have 40 minutes ago, and they were efficient. A 2-person medical team with a proper transport gurney and a defibrillator and the specific practice shorthand of people who moved compromised patients under operational conditions. Sarah briefed them in 90 seconds. Chest tube placement and timing, saturation trend, rib fractures, the abdominal guarding and the absence of imaging, the IV access and current fluid rate. The lead transport medic listened without interrupting and asked 2 questions, both of which were the correct questions, and Sarah revised her initial assessment of them upward. Garrett was moved. Before the transport team took him through the equipment bay door, he turned his head and found Sarah in the room, and he held her eyes for a moment. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The look had the quality of a thing that would be translated into words later, in a different context, by people with different kinds of authority than a patient on a gurney. She nodded. He went through the door. Batam. Rourke was cuffed, zip ties, the federal team's, not police issue, and seated on the floor of the trauma bay while Voss's people processed the room. The 2 other mercenaries were similarly situated. The scene had the organized unglamour of a real operational aftermath, people doing methodical things, documenting, photographing, speaking in the clipped shorthand of professionals managing a large volume of tasks simultaneously. Voss found Sarah at the nursing station. She was writing a patient note, Garrett's chart, which still existed as a hospital record, John Doe admission, and which still required documentation regardless of who had come through the door to take him. She was writing it because it needed to be written and because the act of charting was, she'd found, one of the few things that grounded her when circumstances had been moving too fast for too long. The specificity of it. The requirement to put things in order. "We need a statement," Voss said. "I know. Not tonight. Tomorrow, at the field office. Formal debrief." He paused. "There are people who are going to want to talk to you about more than just what happened today." She kept writing. Writing. "I assumed. Your file? My file is sealed. Was sealed." He let that sit for a moment. "Things change when someone puts a needle in one of the people looking for you and runs a recovery operation inside a compromised ER with a scalpel in her pocket." She looked up from the chart. "I didn't use the scalpel." "I know. But you had it." He said it without judgment. "I'm not here to reopen anything. I'm here to tell you that the people on the other end of this are going to have questions, and some of those questions are going to be about who you were before you came to Calverton, and you should have someone with you when they ask." Sarah considered that. "The same people who will have questions about me, do they have questions about Rourke? About what Rourke was doing and who paid for it?" "Yes." "Those questions matter more." "They're not mutually exclusive." She looked back at the chart. "I'll be at the field office at 9. Voss accepted that and moved away, and Sarah finished the chart in the quiet that followed, which was not a comfortable quiet, but was at least a genuine one, the quiet of a situation that had stopped moving rather than one that was only pausing. Lawrence Briggs found her 20 minutes later. She had expected him. She'd been waiting for him, in a peripheral way, the way you wait for weather you can see on the horizon. You don't stand there watching it, but you know it's coming and you've noted the direction. He came to the nursing station where she was finishing the last of her documentation, and he stood beside her for a moment without speaking, which was unusual for Briggs, who deployed silence only strategically. This silence felt different, less strategic. "Sarah," he said. She didn't look up. "Dr. Briggs, what I saw today..." He stopped, started again. "The way you handled... I did my job. You did considerably more than... I kept a patient stable under adverse conditions, and I coordinated with the responding team. That's triage nursing." She said it flatly, not from anger, but because it was accurate. "It's what I've been doing here for 6 years. Briggs was quiet again. She looked at him then because she was curious about his face, and what she found on it was not what she'd expected. She'd expected the particular expression of a man revising his professional assessment, the controlled, slightly pained look of someone who has been wrong in a way that costs him something. That was there. But underneath it was something else. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, like the first honest discomfort she'd seen on his face in 6 years of watching him be comfortably certain about things. "I was wrong about you," he said. "Specifically, not just today." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said. "You were." She picked up her charts and moved toward the supply station, and Briggs didn't follow her. She didn't know if he would carry the discomfort forward into anything that changed behavior, or if it would metabolize back into the same certainties by morning. People were not transformed by single events as often as narrative logic suggested they should be. But the words had been said, and they were specific, and that was more than 6 years had previously produced. The federal agents interviewing Rourke were in the small conference room off the administrative corridor, a room that was ordinarily used for family consultations and difficult conversations, and which now held 2 people with credentials and recording equipment, and a man in zip ties whose lawyer was, apparently, 45 minutes away, and whose cooperation was, apparently, not forthcoming. Sarah knew this because Voss told her, briefly, in passing, and because she heard Rourke's voice through the closed door at one point. Not the words, but the tone, which had not changed from the flat controlled instrument it had been all day. Men like Rourke didn't change tone when their operations failed. They waited. What Rourke didn't know, because Sarah had not been in a position to tell him and had no obligation to, was that the drive Voss had secured contained more than financial routing codes. This she learned from an agent named Priya Sadler, who came to find her in the supply corridor with a tablet and a specific expression. "The data on the device includes operational logs," Sadler said, "communications, locations, dates, going back 31 months. That's a long time. It includes authorization records." Sadler paused. "We have names, senior names, not just Rourke." Sarah understood what that meant in terms of scope. "How many?" 9 individuals across 4 organizations. 2 of them are domestic." Sadler's voice was careful. "This is going to take time to process, but it's not going to go away." "And Garrett?" "He's in surgery. The abdominal injury was what you thought. Liver contusion, manageable. He'll be out in a few hours." A pause. "He asked us to tell you he's sorry for the syringe." Sarah frowned. "That was my syringe. I used it on Tanner." "I think he meant a different one, from about 4 years ago." Sadler watched her face. "I gather you 2 have history I'm not cleared for." "I gather," Sarah said, "that there are several things about today that I'll be explaining tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Sadler nodded and withdrew. Sarah stood in the supply corridor alone for a moment. 4 years ago. She tried to locate the reference and couldn't, and then she stopped trying because the supply corridor was not the place, and whatever Garrett had meant had survived 4 years and a mercenary operation and a chest tube replacement and would survive another 12 hours. She went back to work. Tanner was picked up at the East Loading Dock at 11:17 p.m., which was 1 hour and 40 minutes after Voss had called it in, which meant he'd found somewhere to wait rather than immediately running. The detail that reached Sarah came from Marcus Webb, who heard it from the federal agent processing the ER's events log, and Marcus delivered it to Sarah with the particular expression of a person who has spent a very long day being peripheral to events that have permanently recalibrated his understanding of who he works with. "They got him," Marcus said. "I know. He was in the boiler room, just sitting there." Sarah considered that. A man who'd sat in a boiler room for an hour 40, waiting, running his own calculation about when to move. She thought about the needle in his neck and the look on his face afterward. Not the shock, but what had come after the shock. The reassessment. "Is he talking?" she asked. "I don't know. I don't think they've said yet." He wasn't, as it turned out. But that was the thing about the information on the drive. Talking wasn't required when documentation existed. Rourke's operation had been documented from the inside by someone with access and patience and a very specific kind of foresight. The documentation did not need Tanner or Rourke to confirm it. It needed a jury. That was a different day's problem. What tonight's problem was the 6 patients who'd been displaced or delayed during the occupation of Bay 2, and the documentation that needed to catch up with reality, and the physical department that needed to be returned to operational status before the morning shift arrived. Sarah worked through it methodically and without much conversation, partly because there was too much to do and partly because the people around her were still processing the day in ways that made conversation feel like an intrusion. Donna Kirsch arrived at midnight. She hadn't been on shift. She'd been called. By whom? Sarah didn't know. And she came in wearing civilian clothes and a look that Sarah had never seen on her face before, which was a look of someone who has been told something and is still deciding what to do with it. She found Sarah at the medication station and stood beside her and didn't say anything for a moment. "You could have told me," Donna said finally. "Told you what?" "That you knew how to—" Donna paused. "That you'd done things before this." It wasn't relevant. Today it was. Sarah thought about that. Today was a specific set of circumstances. Most days are not. Donna looked at her. The look had the quality of 6 years of shared hallways and difficult shifts and small professional kindnesses compressed into something that was trying to find its shape. "I told you to lower your profile," Donna said, "after Briggs and the Ochoa thing. I remember. I was wrong to say that. You were trying to protect me." "I was trying to make things easier for myself," Donna said. The directness of it, the willingness to hold it without dressing it up, made Sarah look at her. "If you'd lowered your profile, you'd have been easier to manage, easier to schedule around. I told myself it was for you." The honesty in that was the kind that didn't come easily to most people, and Sarah acknowledged it without performing a response to it. "You also called Yolanda Marsh." Donna was quiet for a beat. "Marcus told me what you said, about Ochoa. Marsh was out of state. She couldn't do anything." "She called the federal tip line," Donna said. "Apparently she's known something about Garrett's situation for weeks. She didn't know it was going to land here." A pause. "She's the one who told them where the drive might be. She'd been talking to Garrett's handler." Sarah absorbed that. The layered coincidence of it. Marsh, who'd listened when Sarah called about Ochoa, who'd been holding a piece of this separate situation, whose action tonight had closed a loop that Sarah hadn't known existed. The things that connected without you seeing the connection until the whole shape revealed itself. "She's going to be all right?" Sarah asked. "Marsh?" "She's in San Antonio. She's fine." Donna straightened. "You should go home. You've been here since 6:47. "I know what time I arrived." "Sarah?" 20 minutes. I need to finish the log." Donna looked at her for a moment with the complicated expression of a person who has revised a relationship in a single evening and is still locating the revised version. 20 minutes, Donna said. "Then I'm driving you myself." She moved off toward the nursing station and Sarah watched her go and turned back to the log. The log took 32 minutes, not 20, because logs were like that. She found 2 documentation gaps from the afternoon that needed addenda. A medication record that needed a co-signature from a physician who was still on site, and a patient tracking entry for Garrett's John Doe admission that needed to be flagged for federal records hold in a process she'd never done before and had to call the records department to understand. At 12:41 a.m., she was standing in the parking structure at her car. Second level, space 14, the same space she'd pulled into at 6:34 that morning, which now felt like something experienced by a different person in a different configuration of the world. Her phone had 19 missed calls. She'd known they were accumulating. She looked at them now, 4 from her sister in Flagstaff, who'd apparently seen something on local news, 3 from a number she didn't recognize that had left no voicemails, 2 from the hospital's administrative office, 1 from a restricted number that she suspected was Voss or someone adjacent to Voss. The rest from people whose names she saw and felt but couldn't process right now. She sat in the driver's seat without starting the car. The parking structure was quiet. A few vehicles on the upper decks, the distant amber of the structure's lighting, the faint highway sound that Calverton always had at this hour, the particular white noise of a mid-sized city that never fully went to sleep. She'd sat in this parking structure many times at the end of a shift, usually for less than a minute before putting the car in gear. But tonight she sat for longer. 4 years ago. Whatever Garrett had meant, it had survived. Whatever she'd carried here from a previous version of her life, the skills, the instincts, the compartments that had been built with great care and maintained with great effort, had not gone away. She'd known that. She'd just stopped having to know it actively, and today had required knowing it actively, and the shift between those 2 states had a cost she hadn't finished paying yet. She started the car. Her apartment was 12 minutes from the hospital on the route she drove, less on the route she usually avoided because it took her past the stretch of industrial buildings on the south side of Calverton that reminded her, in a way she'd never explained to anyone, of a particular kind of perimeter terrain that she'd spent a lot of time inside. She drove the 12-minute route. She was 4 blocks from her building when her phone rang. The restricted number. She answered on the second ring. Nolan. Boss's voice. What? Tanner's talking. A pause. Not about Rourke, about you. She felt something change in the quiet of the car. Not alarm exactly. Something more like the recognition of a terrain shift. The feeling of ground that was level suddenly revealing a grade. What about me? He says he didn't find you through the hospital. He says he found the hospital because of you. Voss's voice was careful, not accusatory. Careful in the way of someone delivering information that is more complex than it looks. He says Rourke's people flagged your identity 6 weeks ago. They didn't know you were here. They found the pattern of a set of clinical interventions in a southwestern hospital that matched the profile of someone they were already looking for. Sarah was stopped at a red light 3 blocks from her building. Someone they were already looking for, she said. Not you specifically. Someone with your background. Someone with your particular training profile. A pause. Rourke wasn't here for Garrett, Sarah. Garrett was how they got into the building. Rourke was here because someone told him there was a person at Harlow Ridge who knew something she shouldn't have known for 4 years, something that predates the drive. The light changed. She didn't move through it. What does Rourke know? She said. That's what we're trying to establish, but here's the problem. Voss stopped. She could hear something in the background, voices, movement. Tanner made 1 phone call before we picked him up. From the boiler room. We have the number. We're running it, but it's going to take until morning and… Voss? Yeah. Who was Rourke working for? A silence. Long enough to be its own answer. We're not certain yet, Voss said. But Tanner's description of the authorization chain above Rourke includes someone with federal credentials. Sarah looked at the empty intersection in front of her. The people who came tonight, she said slowly. Your team, who authorized the operation. Another silence. Shorter this time, but no less weighted. I need you to listen to me carefully, Voss said. I need you to not go home tonight. Sarah looked in the rearview mirror. A pair of headlights had been 2 blocks behind her since the parking structure. They were still 2 blocks behind her, stationary at the same light she'd been sitting at, waiting as she'd waited and not pulling through. I see them, she said. Don't go home, Voss said again. Drive somewhere public, somewhere with people and cameras. I'm sending a car. Sarah looked in the rearview mirror at the stationary headlights. How long? She said. 8 minutes. Where? There's a 24-hour diner on Alcott and 5th. Parking lot faces the street. Stay in your car until my people reach you. She pulled through the intersection without signaling. She went straight when her building was left. The headlights behind her moved through the intersection 30 seconds later. Not immediate, not panicked, patient. And settled 2 blocks back in the same position they'd held since the parking structure. 2 blocks was a professional interval, not too close to be obvious, not far enough to lose a car in light traffic. She drove to Alcott and 5th. The diner was a flat-roofed building with a red sign and a parking lot that was maybe a third full at this hour. The way diners at 1 in the morning were. A few truckers, a couple of people who'd finished late shifts somewhere, 1 table through the window that was just visible from the parking lot where 2 people were sharing a plate of something and not talking. Sarah pulled in and parked facing the street and left the engine running and watched in her mirrors. The headlights did not follow her into the lot. They passed on Alcott at a normal speed and continued south and were gone. She sat with that for a moment. Either they'd broken off because the lot was too public, or she'd misread the situation, or there was a third vehicle she hadn't identified. She ran back through the last 12 minutes, the parking structure, the red light, the interval. She hadn't misread it. The vehicle had been maintaining deliberate distance since she'd left the structure. Voss's car arrived in 6 minutes, not 8. A dark sedan, 2 people inside, federal credentials visible through the driver's window when they pulled alongside her. The driver was a woman, mid-30s, no expression. The passenger was a man Sarah didn't recognize who got out and came to her window. Voss sent us, he said. Can you come with us? Where? Field office. Tonight, not tomorrow. There's been a development. She looked at him. He had the particular quality of someone who had been awake for too long and was managing it by removing everything from their face that required energy. She recognized the quality. "Let me make a call first," she said. She called her sister in Flagstaff. 3 rings, then the sleepy, slightly alarmed voice of someone who'd been watching their phone and not sleeping. She told her sister she was fine, that the news coverage was accurate in some ways and not in others, and that she would explain when she could, and that it would probably be a few days. Her sister said several things in response, most of them variations on worry expressed as statements of fact, and Sarah listened and said she understood and meant it, and ended the call. She got in the sedan. Oh. The field office was a building she'd driven past once on her second week in Calverton, and noted the way she noted certain kinds of buildings, by the things that were not visible rather than the things that were. Unmarked vehicles. Antenna arrays that were the wrong style for commercial use. A camera placement pattern that covered more angles than a private security setup required. Inside at 1:38 in the morning, it had the particular energy of a place that had been expecting to wind down and had been redirected. People moving with the slightly ragged efficiency of a long operational day that had acquired an additional complication. Voss met her in a hallway and walked her to a room that was not an interrogation room. It had the furniture of a conference space, but configured for a smaller group, chairs around a table, rather than the table against the wall with one chair facing it. There were 3 people already in the room. Voss sat. Sarah sat. "The vehicle that followed you," Voss said. "We pulled footage from a traffic camera on Alcott. The plates are registered to a leasing company in Phoenix that is one of the shell entities on the drive." Sarah absorbed that. "So Rourke's people." "Rourke's people, or the people above Rourke's people." Voss opened a folder on the table. "Here's what Tanner told us in the past 2 hours. The authorization chain above Rourke includes an individual named Warren Delacroix, Deputy Director, Interagency Coordination, Domestic Operations." He put a photograph on the table. Sarah looked at it. The man in the photograph was 60, white hair, the kind of institutional bearing that came from decades inside federal bureaucracy. She didn't recognize his face, but she recognized the context around it. The background in the photo was a room she'd been in once, briefly, 8 years ago, during a debrief that had been classified at a level she hadn't held clearance for and had attended as a subordinate to someone who had. "He was at my exit debrief," she said. "We know." "He wasn't introduced." "No, he was observing." Voss's voice stayed even. "What we believe, and we're still building this, is that Delacroix has known your location since approximately 2 years after you resigned your commission. He's had passive surveillance on you since then. Not active, passive, watching to see if you'd surface anything." "Anything meaning what?" "Meaning the operation that your unit ran in the 4 months before you resigned." He paused. "We believe you encountered documentation during that operation that Delacroix didn't know you'd encountered. Financial documentation. Routing codes for accounts that, as it turns out, are the same accounts on Garrett's drive." The room was quiet. Sarah looked at the photograph of Warren Delacroix on the table. 4 years ago, she'd been in a position that no longer existed in her life. She'd encountered a set of documents during a routine secure comms relay. Not a mission, not an operational context, a logistics function, that she'd flagged through proper channels and been told, in language that was careful and final, did not require further attention. She had accepted that. She had resigned 4 months later for reasons that she'd understood as her own reasons, and that were her own reasons, and she'd driven to Calverton and taken a nursing position and built the life she had now. She had never in 6 years reconsidered whether those reasons were only her own. "Garrett," she said. "Garrett's been building the evidentiary case for 14 months, Voss said. "He found the same financial thread you encountered. He didn't know you'd seen it until about 6 weeks ago, when Delacroix's surveillance pattern on you changed, went from passive to active, and Garrett's handler identified the change and ran the connection backward." A pause. "You were the corroborating witness Delacroix didn't know existed. The reason the case is airtight is that there are now 2 separate, unconnected people who encountered the documentation at different times. I didn't keep anything. You don't need to have kept it. Your testimony about what you saw, when you saw it, what you were told about it, and by whom, that's what matters. That creates the chain." Voss looked at her steadily. Delacroix sent Rourke here partly to find the drive and partly to assess how much you knew. If you'd been just a nurse who happened to work at the same hospital where Garrett ended up, he'd have pulled back. But Tanner's report to Rourke about the way you handled the room, about the supply closet, about the needle, confirmed what Delacroix suspected. Sarah thought about Tanner in the boiler room, making one phone call. He told Delacroix I was operational, she said. Yes. And Delacroix sent the vehicle. We believe so. We're running the authorization. She looked at the photograph again, at Warren Delacroix's institutional face, the face of a man who had spent decades learning to be in rooms without being introduced and understood the power in that. Where is he now? She said. That, Voss said, is what we've been working on since midnight. Warren Delacroix was arrested at 6:14 in the morning at Dulles International Airport. This Sarah learned not from Voss but from the television in the field office break room, which was tuned to a national news network, and which, at 6:47, interrupted its regular programming for a developing story about a federal official detained at a major international airport. The Chiron identified him. The anchor's voice had the particular controlled quality of someone delivering information that had arrived faster than the surrounding context, which meant the arrest had been real and recent and the coverage was catching up. She was sitting in the break room with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention, and she watched the screen without moving for a long moment. The story, as it existed in those first 40 minutes of coverage, was incomplete. It mentioned a federal investigation. It mentioned an arrest on charges that had not yet been fully specified in the public record. It mentioned briefly a connection to a private military operation that had occurred the previous evening at a medical facility in New Mexico. It did not mention Sarah's name. It did not mention Garrett's name. It did not mention a drive or a storage closet or a tube of irrigation fluid that had sat in the same position for 8 months. What it mentioned was Rourke, because Rourke had already been processed and his name had made it into the arrest record that was public. And Tanner. And the 2 men from the trauma bay. And the exterior team that Voss's people had collected from the parking structure and the North Access Road. 7 arrests total in Calverton, 1 at Dulles. Voss came into the break room at 7:03. Delacroix's attorney is already in, he said. He's not talking, doesn't matter. The drive covers the first 11 years. Tanner's statement covers the operational chain. Your testimony, when it's recorded, covers the origin point. He poured himself a coffee from the pot that had been sitting since before Sarah arrived. He looked at it and drank it anyway. It's enough. Will it hold? Sarah said. The financial evidence alone would take a decade to unwrap legally. With the witness chain, yes, it holds. He sat down across from her. There are going to be additional charges as the shell entities get unraveled. Some of them are going to implicate people who aren't in custody yet. That's going to be a long process. Delacroix specifically. Conspiracy, fraud, abuse of authority, directing an armed private operation against federal personnel on domestic soil. Voss ticked them off without drama. The last one carries weight. A deputy director who used a private mercenary team inside the United States against a federal asset. The agency is not going to slow walk that. This is the kind of case that becomes a defining prosecution. Sarah looked at her cold coffee. The passive surveillance, she said. The 2 years of watching me. Part of the case. Unauthorized domestic surveillance of a civilian with no active clearance is its own count. He was watching me work triage at a hospital for 2 years. Yes. She thought about what that meant. About the 6 years she'd spent in Calverton building something specific, a contained life, useful work, the daily practice of keeping people alive in a department that didn't always make it easy. And about the fact that somewhere in that period, a man in Washington had been receiving reports about her. About the Ochoa case, possibly. About the scope of practice conflicts with Briggs. About the quiet patterns of a person who had put away a particular set of skills and was trying to live in the space those skills had vacated. She wasn't angry. She expected to be and wasn't, which was its own kind of information. What she felt was something older and less clean than anger, a tiredness that was not about sleep deprivation, a weight that had to do with the accumulated cost of being underestimated and surveilled and managed and ultimately treated by a man with federal credentials and a long institutional memory as a variable to be controlled rather than a person who had made choices. She drank the cold coffee. I need to give the formal statement, she said. Agent Sadler will take it. She's ready when you are. And then? And then you're free to go. We'll need you available for proceedings when they develop, but there's no restriction on your movement. He paused. Your seal, on your service record. It'll be reviewed as part of the investigation process. I can't promise what comes out of that review. I'm not asking for promises. Some of what comes out might change how people look at what you did before Calverton. Some of what I did before Calverton, I'm fine with people not looking at. Voss looked at her. In his face was a quality she hadn't seen there in the hours she'd known him. Something that was not professional assessment. Something that was closer to the look of a person who has witnessed a thing and is still deciding what category to put it in. Okay, he said. Agent Sadler's in room 3 when you're ready. He took his bad coffee and left. What? The formal statement took 4 hours. Not because the events were complicated. Sarah had good recall and organized it efficiently. But because the prior history required context, and the context required care. And Agent Sadler was thorough in the way of someone who understood that this document would be read by people who'd spend years with it. Sarah told it in sequence. The documents she'd encountered 8 years ago, the language she'd been given when she flagged them, the decision to resign that she now understood in a larger frame than she'd had access to at the time. She told it without ornamentation, without retrospective interpretation beyond what she could support factually, and without the particular self-exculpating tendency she'd observed in formal statements from people who felt defensive about their choices. She wasn't defensive about her choices. She'd made them with the information she had at each point. Agent Sadler, to her credit, did not perform sympathy or professional warmth. She was simply precise and attentive, and when Sarah finished, she said, "Is there anything you want to add that we haven't covered?" And Sarah said no, and Sadler said, "Thank you, Miss Nolan." And Sarah recognized that the use of the civilian title rather than any military designation was itself information about how this proceeding would be framed, and was fine with it. She left the field office at 11:43 a.m. Outside, Calverton was doing what it did on a weekday morning. Traffic, the particular quality of New Mexico light that had no equivalent she'd found anywhere else. The dry, cool air that would be warm by afternoon. She stood in the field office parking lot and thought about whether she needed to sleep before she did anything else, and determined that she probably did, but that she wasn't going to. She drove to the hospital instead. Harlow Ridge in the late morning had the recovering quality of a place that had been through something and was in the process of reassembling its routines. The department had operated through the night. It always did. It had to. But the night crew had managed an understaffed floor under unusual circumstances, and the morning crew was coming into the particular organized chaos of a handoff that was larger than normal. Sarah was not scheduled to work. She walked in through the ambulance bay entrance in her civilian clothes, and went directly to the nursing station and found Donna Kirsch managing the morning in the way Donna managed complicated mornings, which was by moving continuously and speaking in complete, actionable sentences, and not apologizing for any of it. Donna looked up when Sarah appeared. Her expression went through 2 or 3 things quickly and settled. "You're not on shift," Donna said. "I know. I needed to see the board." Donna looked at her for a moment. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine. The board." Donna turned the patient tracking screen toward her. Sarah scanned it. Current census, room assignments, pending discharges, 2 patients flagged for follow-up. She noted a name in Bay 1 that had a vitals trend she didn't like the look of and said so. "I flagged it an hour ago," Donna said. "Dr. Marsh is on remote consult." Sarah nodded. "Good." "She called this morning," Donna added, "from San Antonio. She asked how you were doing." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you were doing what you always do, which is work, while everyone else is still deciding what to think." Sarah looked at the board a moment longer. The department around her was operating, the sounds of it, the movement, the particular percussion of a functional ER that was absorbing its caseload and managing its complications and doing the 10,000 small things that kept people alive. She had been part of this specific percussion for 6 years. She knew what it sounded like when it was off rhythm, and she knew what it sounded like now. It sounded like itself. "I'm coming in tomorrow," Sarah said. "Regular shift." Donna didn't look surprised. "I put you on the schedule this morning. I figured." Sarah looked at her. "Don't," Donna said. "Don't make it a thing. You were always on the schedule. I just confirmed it." The formality of Donna's non-formality made Sarah look away and back at the board. and she was quiet for a moment with the particular feeling of someone who has been prepared for acknowledgement and found the real thing smaller and more substantial than the prepared version. "Briggs asked about you this morning," Donna said. "What did you tell him?" "That you'd be back tomorrow." A pause. "He said, and I'm quoting, that he intended to put a formal commendation in your file for the events of yesterday." Sarah was quiet. "He also said," Donna continued, with the careful neutrality of someone reporting information they have opinions about, "that he'd been reviewing the Ochoa documentation and that he believed his response at the time was, I think the word he used was disproportionate. He doesn't need to do that." "No, but he's doing it." Donna looked at her directly. "Sarah, he was wrong. He knows he was wrong. Some people actually try to fix things when they figure that out. I know." "Do you?" Sarah looked at the department around her. At Marcus Webb finishing a chart at the far end of the station. At the resident Pollard she'd assessed last night. He was in today, slightly pale but functional, managing a patient in Bay 3 with the specific attentiveness of someone who'd spent a night recalibrating what they thought they knew about what happened in this building. At the day shift, nurses moving through their routines with the practiced efficiency of people who'd showed up, anyway, who'd always shown up, who showed up every day in a job that was too loud and too demanding and not compensated proportionally to what it asked, and who did it because something in them had looked at the work and said, "This matters, and I can do this, and so I will." She'd spent 6 years being invisible in this place. She'd spent 6 years being told, in 100 different framings, that her job was to execute rather than think, to follow rather than assess, to stay in the lane assigned to her and trust that the people in the wider lanes knew what they were doing. She'd spent 6 years knowing they didn't always, and doing what she could anyway. And the gap between what she was permitted to do and what she knew needed to be done had been a constant low friction, like driving with the handbrake slightly on. Yesterday, the handbrake had come off. Not because a crisis made her relevant, not because circumstances validated something that had been waiting for validation, but because she had been doing the same work all along, making the same assessments, carrying the same knowledge. And the moment that had revealed it was just a moment. The arbitrary compression of a situation into a form where the things she'd always done were suddenly visible to the people who'd been looking past her for years. That visibility didn't change what she'd been. It only changed what they could see. "I'm going home to sleep," she said. "I'll be in tomorrow at 6:45. 6:47, Donna said. "You're always 13 minutes early." Sarah almost smiled. 6:47 then. She turned toward the exit. The drive home in daylight was 12 minutes on the same route she'd taken the night before, and she drove it without the hyper-specific awareness of last night, which wasn't carelessness. It was the difference between a situation that required everything and a situation that required presence. She was present. She watched the street the way she always watched streets, which was with more attention than most people used and less than she'd used when it was a professional requirement. Her apartment was quiet and ordinary and exactly as she'd left it at 6:32 the previous morning. She stood in it for a moment in the particular way of returning to a space after something significant, taking inventory of what was the same, which was everything, and allowing the everything the same to absorb the weight of the hours since. She ate something. She didn't remember deciding to eat or choosing what. She sat on the couch and turned on the news and watched the coverage of the Delacroix arrest develop into something more coherent than the early morning reports had been. There were now named sources, a fuller charge sheet, analysis from a former federal prosecutor who explained, in terms accessible to a general audience, what the authorization chain meant and why it mattered. Rourke's name. Tanner's. The shell companies. Warren Delacroix, in footage from outside a federal building in Washington, being escorted by 2 agents through a door, not looking at the cameras but clearly aware of them. The posture of a man who had spent decades understanding the mechanics of institutional power and was now on the wrong side of them. The coverage mentioned the encrypted device. It mentioned a network of 23 entities across multiple countries. It mentioned that several additional individuals were expected to be identified and charged in the coming weeks as the financial investigation expanded. It did not mention Sarah's name or Garrett's or Harlow Ridge Medical Center in Calverton, New Mexico, or a small supply closet at the end of a back corridor where a nurse, who was not only a nurse, had reached behind a box that nobody had moved in 8 months, and closed her hand around something that turned a surveillance operation into a criminal case. She was fine with that. She turned off the television. The apartment was quiet in a way that was different from last night's quiet. Last night's quiet had been the quiet of aftermath, of something still settling. This was just the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday afternoon in a place where she lived. She'd been looking for ordinary for 6 years and had mostly found it, and on the days she didn't find it, she had gone back the next morning in the same blue scrubs to the same department and done the same work until ordinary reasserted itself. She was going to keep doing that. Not because the alternative had been restored to her, because it hadn't been, and she didn't want it to be, and the clarity of that had been confirmed by yesterday in a way that 6 years of ordinary routine had obscured somewhat. She had been a person who took lives with precision and training and institutional authorization, and she had walked away from that and become a person who used the same precision and training to keep lives in the body. And that direction of travel was not something yesterday had reversed. It was something yesterday had confirmed. There was a cost to being underestimated that people who'd never experienced it systematically didn't understand. Not the dramatic cost of a single moment of dismissal. That was survivable, and most people learned to survive it. The real cost was cumulative. The slow erosion that happened when the people around you consistently refused to perceive you accurately, when your assessments were ignored until they couldn't be ignored, when the knowledge you carried was treated as insufficient until circumstances made it visible. Over years, that erosion did something to a person. Not breaking them, people were more resilient than the erosion anticipated, but changing the shape of how they held themselves. The careful way you learned to present what you knew, the calibration of how much to say and when. The 6 years running judgment call about what was worth fighting for and what needed to be absorbed. The thing nobody told you was that the erosion also built something, the endurance of it, the discipline of continuing to do the work well regardless of whether anyone was watching it done well. The quiet, non-performative integrity of caring about your patient's saturation at 3 in the morning when the physician on call had signed off and gone home. Sarah had that. She'd had it before Calverton and she'd built more of it here. That wasn't a consolation prize for being underestimated. It wasn't a reframe of a bad situation into a good one. It was just true. The person who had walked into that supply closet yesterday afternoon and reached behind a box of irrigation fluid was a person who'd been shaped by all of it. The combat experience and the medical training and the 6 years of triage shifts and the Ochoa case and the morning Briggs told her to stay in her lane and the morning she ignored him. All of it. She fell asleep on the couch with the afternoon light coming through the windows at a low angle and the phone on the cushion beside her where she could hear it if it rang. It didn't ring. She slept for 4 hours and woke to the early dark of a high desert evening and lay still for a moment, taking inventory in the way she always did. Where she was, what time, what was next. And what came up when she asked what was next was, tomorrow, 6:47, the same department, the same scrubs, the same work. She got up. She ate a real meal this time, at the kitchen table, and washed the dishes after and called her sister back and had a conversation that was long and not easy and necessary. And after she hung up, she sat with the difficulty of it rather than putting it away, because some things needed to be sat with rather than filed. Her sister had said, "I didn't know you used to do those things. I didn't know that was you." Sarah had said, "Most of it was a long time ago." Her sister had said, "But you're still that person." And Sarah had thought about it, about what that meant, about whether the person who'd reached into the supply closet yesterday was a resurfacing of something she'd buried or a continuation of something she'd never actually stopped being. And she'd said, "I don't know if I'm still that person, but I know what I'm doing now, and that's enough." Her sister had been quiet for a moment and then said, "I just want you to be okay." "I'm okay," Sarah had said. She meant it. Not in the way people mean it when they're managing someone else's worry. In the direct way, she was okay. She was intact. She was the same person she'd been at 6:47 yesterday morning, minus the pretense that the past she'd walked away from had stayed as still as she had. The next morning, she drove to Harlow Ridge Medical Center in the dark before sunrise, parked in Space 14 on the second level, and walked in through the main entrance at 6:47. She changed into her scrubs. She checked the board. She read the overnight notes and identified 2 patients whose vitals trends needed attention before the attending physician arrived to make that determination. and she flagged both with documentation that was specific and accurate and appropriately within the scope of a triage nurse's observation. She was at her station when Briggs arrived. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had prepared something to say and was determining whether the moment required it to be said. "Sarah," he said. "Dr. Briggs." A pause. He seemed to be choosing between the prepared version and a shorter one. He chose the shorter one. "I'm glad you're back." She looked at him. He meant it. She could tell. And the fact that it was complicated for him to mean it, that it sat alongside everything he'd said and done in the preceding 6 years and required him to hold both things simultaneously, made it more real rather than less. "Thank you," she said. She meant that too. She turned back to the board. Outside, Calverton was beginning its morning. Somewhere in the city, people were waking up who had no idea that a woman in a triage department had spent 17 hours the day before making the decisions that kept them in a world where a federal authorization chain was accountable rather than invisible. They didn't know her name. They didn't know what she'd carried into that hospital, or what she'd left there, or what the particular combination of a medical background and a combat history, and 6 years of being told she wasn't enough had enabled her to do. That was fine. She hadn't done it to be known. She'd done it because it needed doing, and she was the person there, and she was capable, and those 3 things together had always been sufficient reason. The first patient of the morning came through the doors at 7:02. Sarah looked up from the board. She assessed in the first 4 seconds. 40-ish, male, left arm guarded, gait slightly uneven but not compromised, face tight with the specific expression of someone managing pain rather than overwhelmed by it. "Come on back," she said. "Let's see what we've got." She stood up from the station and walked toward him and did what she had always done, in this department and in every context before it. She looked at what was in front of her and she dealt with it honestly and completely, with everything she knew and everything she was, which was never the simple version of either. It had never been the simple version. The people who thought it was had been the ones looking past her. She had learned, over enough years and enough rooms and enough mornings like this one, that the only reliable measure of a person wasn't what the people around them thought they were capable of. It was what they did when the room went dark, and the choices narrowed, and there was no version of the situation left that didn't require them to use everything. She knew what she did in those moments.